John Kramer lectured in psychology at Queen's University Belfast for over 30 years and has played an active role in applied sport and exercise psychology throughout that time. John has worked with national and international teams and athletes from over 50 sports and continues to publish widely, including his most recent best-selling book, Pure Sport.
So far, the focus has deliberately been about building your positive mental resources for the challenge ahead. But let's face it, it isn't always going to be plain sailing. Even the best laid plans can go awry, either during training or maybe during the marathon itself. And on these occasions, there'll be a need to have the mental resources to deal with setbacks as well. Before we look at these, please don't imagine that those who succeed are necessarily those who have superhuman powers that they can draw on in times of need. Even the most talented athletes will tell you that what made them good were not the times when things went well, but their setbacks and how they came through those hard times, stronger and better able to deal with adversity. A lot of what we've covered so far is about building confidence to a point where you feel that you've prepared well and are on the right track. But it makes sense to include in your preparation those contingencies for when things maybe aren't quite as good as they could be. Let's begin by reviewing your goal setting. Looking back at the third clip in the series, this was designed to help you feel good and self-motivated. But it could be that by now, maybe you've come to realise that your expectations or targets were perhaps too ambitious. It could be that you simply didn't have the time or the resources to devote to your training. Or maybe an injury came along and things started to slip. Don't worry, and certainly don't fall into the trap of completely abandoning ship at this stage. As they say, stuff happens. Instead, now would be the time to review and readjust in light of present circumstances what is actually achievable and realistic, using the same acronym as before, SCAMP. Only now reassessing and putting something back in place that will work for you and not against you. Having sorted out where you're heading, we can also consider how to deal with negative thoughts that may come along to trip you up. One can be where you start to frame the challenges ahead as negatives, as pressures or threats, that can thereby grow bigger and bigger the more you dwell on them. The legendary 5-time Olympic champion discus thrower, Al Oerter, used to hate the pressure of keeping his fantastic technique in wet conditions when the throwing circle was slippery. He hated that pressure, but managed to turn it round by accepting and loving the challenge of coming to terms with maintaining his technique whatever the conditions. In the process, often deliberately soaking the circle with a bucket of water before training. He loved the challenge and he thereby banished the threat. With this example in mind, now try this simple exercise. Bring to mind one part of your running or your training that you really find difficult to cope with. Complete this sentence with a pet hate. I hate the pressure of maybe running into a headwind, maybe being overtaken, even shutting out negative thoughts. Now what I'd like you to do is turn it around and instead, using the same example, complete this sentence. I love the challenge of. Could be something like keeping your rhythm whatever the conditions. In short, learn to use self-talk to inspire you and not to conspire against you. In this way, the negatives can usually be turned round to the positives, and the language or self-talk you use to think about and discuss your running can then play a huge part in keeping the experience positive. The next time you hear yourself talking yourself into a dark hole, just stop and ask yourself, why would you? Thought stopping isn't difficult, but you've got to want to do it. Let's face it, if you really want to hurt yourself, there are lots of better ways of doing that than running a marathon. When the negatives come along, the first thing to do is to block them. Use simple mental images to help. This could be something like a stop sign or a red hand. And then replace those thoughts with something more positive, or even a positive image. If you are one of those people who are inclined to let things get on top of you, why not just draw a simple curved line on the back of your hand? Glance at it and make yourself smile. Life and you shouldn't be taken that seriously. In a similar vein, the cyclist Bradley Wiggins actually has a bee tattooed on each thumb. as a reminder to himself of the important things in his life, and they are always the last thing he looks at just before he races. The B's stand for his two children, Ben and Bella. In a slightly different way, if you start to struggle at times during a run, remember the imagery techniques we discussed in clip 4. Bring to mind an image, thought, even a tune to drive the negatives away. And if you're inclined to pessimism instead of optimism, work hard to think of what you've done, not what is left to be done. The glass is therefore half full, not half empty. When all is said and done, when you run, you want to remove any excess baggage so you can run light. And one way to think of negative thoughts is as just that, as your excess baggage. Negative thoughts will weigh you down. They'll pull you backwards over time. For example, going over something you could have done differently or regret having done. But critically, you have to see these things in the past as over. Draw the line. Looking backwards or looking forwards is not going to help you to run any better. Instead, try to keep your head in the present. The time for reflection is after you've finished, and the time for thinking about past runs should end when you start running. In its simplest terms, if you think of your mental running in terms of these 3 separate phrases, then you won't go far wrong. F it, do it, think about it. In other words, the head you need on the start line is to accept that all the build-up and training is now over, so all you're now going to do is to give it a good rattle. In other words, F it. When you're running, there's no point in dwelling on the past. Keep it fresh, keep it in the here and now. In other words, just do it. And afterwards, then you have all the time in the world to sit and reflect on what went well, and maybe what you'd want to improve the next time around. In other words, that's when you think about it. Keep these 3 separate and the rest becomes as easy as putting one foot in front of the other. But never get them out of step, or that's when you'll trip over.